Okay, if you could turn to Ezekiel 39, Ezekiel chapter 39, and I'll start reading in verse 1. And it says there, "Therefore, thou son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. And I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and will cause thine arrows to fall out of thy right hand. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy bands, and the people that is with thee. I will give thee unto the ravenous birds of every sort, and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. Thou shalt fall upon the open field, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord Jehovah. And I will send a fire on Magog, and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let them pollute my holy name any more, and the heathen shall know that I am Jehovah, the Holy One in Israel. Behold, it is come, and it is done, saith the Lord Jehovah. This is the day whereof I have spoken. And they that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth, and shall set on fire, and burn the weapons, both the shields and the bucklers, the bows and the arrows, and the hand staves and the spears, and they shall burn them with fire 7 years, so that they shall take no wood out of the field, neither cut down any out of the forest, for they shall burn the weapons with fire, and they shall spoil those that spoiled them, and rob those that robbed them, saith the Lord Jehovah." And I'll stop reading there. You know, God has really made a lot of things about the end of the world very complicated. It's extremely difficult. I mean, just look at all that we've learned concerning an end of the church age, a great tribulation. But it wasn't just a great tribulation. There was a first part of 2,300 days, a second part of outpouring of latter rain, a judgment day that we had to learn about after the fact, because we were thinking things would be different, and then we've learned that there's a spiritual judgment. The elect are appearing before the judgment seat of Christ. God is trying all of His people, and on and on and on. It is extremely complicated, and one of the most complicated aspects to it all is Satan. Satan. When we read the Bible, we know that God gives Satan many different names. There are several individuals that typify him. And when we look at Satan's end, when we look at the final end of Satan, it's the most complex and difficult information in the Bible. It's really some of the most complicated things that are in the Bible, because God pictures him so many different ways and speaks about his end in seeming contradictory ways. Like, for example, we know in Isaiah chapter 14 that he's likened to the king of Babylon, and then in that chapter it speaks of his fall. Or you can go to the book of Esther and read about Haman, the adversary, an enemy of the Jews, and the word adversary is the word Satan. Haman is clearly a type of Satan, and then he has a fall where everything's going well for him. He's increasing and growing in glory in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, and then suddenly he falls. And we could work it out according to the calendar of that time, where his fall began on the 17th day of the second month. That's when he had to lead Mordecai on horseback through the streets of the city and to exclaim, behold, such will happen to the one the king delights to honor, or something similar to that. And later the same day, he was hanged on the 17th day of the second month. But that wasn't the end of the evil adversary or enemy of God, because Haman had 10 sons. And those 10 sons lived on for another 10 months about. And that would relate to the 10 horns we read about in the book of Revelation. So we find on one hand, Haman, a type of Satan, is killed, but on the other hand, the evil enemy of the people of God lived on in the form of his sons until the 12th month and the Feast of Purim. So you know, when you're trying to understand the end of Satan, which has everything to do with the timeline and Judgment Day, then you have to harmonize that. We also would have to harmonize Pharaoh, who is said in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 29, where God calls him Pharaoh, the great dragon. So who do you think Pharaoh is representing? One of the names for Satan is dragon. Pharaoh, the great dragon, God slays him and causes him to fall upon the open fields. And it also says it makes him food for the fowls of the air and ravenous birds, or again, something similar to what we actually just read here in Ezekiel 39. Or we read in Luke 11, in Luke chapter 11, verse 17. It says, "But he, knowing their thoughts, said unto them, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and a house divided against a house falleth. If Satan also be divided against himself, how shall his kingdom stand?" And yes, I know Christ is responding to those that said he had Beelzebub. They accused him of being of Satan. But that doesn't mean we don't take into account his statement that a house divided against a house falls. And then he relates it to Satan's kingdom. A house and kingdom are one and the same. That if Satan's house were divided against itself, it would fall. And that's clearer in Mark chapter 3, verse 25 and 26. "And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end." So there God is connecting a divided house, a divided kingdom, to Satan's end. And we see all these references, and there's many more references to the end of Satan. Just look at Revelation 19, where the beast and the false prophet are cast into the lake of fire at the end of that chapter. In Revelation 20, it speaks of the devil being cast into the lake of fire where the beast and false prophet were. And I don't, please don't ask about that later on, because I still don't understand that. What is God trying to teach? But we see that Satan's final destruction that he will experience in the day of judgment is not something easily understood, but it's very complicated. And for a long time, I would read Ezekiel 38 and 39, and it was just too complicated to understand. The problem is that we read of Gog and Magog, and who is Gog and Magog represent? Well, Satan, right? Another type, another figure of Satan. And this is easily seen if you turn to Revelation 20. Revelation 20, beginning in verse 7, it says, "And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog." And this is the only other place outside of Ezekiel 38 and 39 you'll read of Gog and Magog. Only here. So there's no doubt that this is the biblical defining verse for Gog and Magog. It is Satan once he's loosed. Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And when we just look into this, the compassing of the camp of the saints, well, Luke 21, Jerusalem will be compassed about with armies. And Jerusalem is the same as the camp of the saints. It's representative of the corporate church. When Satan comes against the church, like King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army came against Judah, what did they do when they came against Jerusalem or Judah? They compassed it about. That was the tactic for the ancient armies. You just go round about a city, you cut off their food supply, you cut off their water in most cases, and then you wait, and you wait them out, and a famine results. So when God uses that figure of the Jerusalem is compassed about with armies, he really has in view there's a famine in the city. And the famine, according to Amos 8, is not a famine of bread and water, but a famine of hearing the word of the Lord. It has to do with when the Holy Spirit departs out, Satan enters in, and there's spiritual famine. No one can hear, and since faith comes by hearing, no one can become saved. Well, this is what's being described. Satan's loosed. He immediately goes against the corporate church, and that is pictured by Gog and Magog, which is referred to here in Ezekiel 39. And God says in verse 1 of Ezekiel chapter 39, "Therefore, thou son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and leave but the sixth part of thee, and will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel." Now the north parts, if you look at Jeremiah 1, and I think it's mentioned a couple more times in the book of Jeremiah, but in Jeremiah 1, verse 14, "Then Jehovah said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land." All Judea, all Judah. The Babylonians came from the north. Gog and Magog, they come up from the north parts because God is using the north as the direction of Satan, and he's coming against the people of God. He, according to Revelation 20, he compasses the camp of the saints about. So it's pretty clear he's coming against the church. But the problem is that when we read Ezekiel 39, and we read it in verse 1, where it said, behold, or actually a little earlier, therefore thou son of man prophesy against Gog, then behold, I am against thee, O Gog. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is, who loosed Satan? After Satan was bound at the cross in 33 AD, he remained bound for 1955 years of the church age. And then, did he finally wiggle free? Did he somehow gain strength after almost 2,000 years and discover a way to come out of the bottomless pit where he had been bound? No. It actually says earlier in Revelation 20, Christ loosed him. Jesus, eternal God, loosed Satan. His loosing was according to the will of God at the proper time and season. God did it. And we look around at what's going on in the earth, and we look around at what has already happened in the churches, and we see the evidence of Satan's loosing everywhere, and we stand amazed. God loosed him, knowing what an evil being he is, what an evil fallen creature he is, and that he would do these things. Yes, God loosed him to do these things. Remember what it says in Jeremiah 25. In Jeremiah 25, beginning in verse 8, therefore thus saith Jehovah of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north. There again is that direction. Saith Jehovah, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, and a hissing, and perpetual desolations. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth, and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones, and the light of the candle. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So God called Nebuchadnezzar my servant in verse 9. And he was going to do service to God in what way? By destroying those that were called the people of God. By destroying the people of Judah, they would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, by the Babylonian army, and this would accomplish God's purpose in really taking his hand of restraint historically off of Nebuchadnezzar and people from the north, and allowing them to come against God's people, and then not fighting, not defending the city Jerusalem and the people of Judah. Can God fight? Can God defend his people? Or was the Babylonian army too much? Well, no, of course not. We have all kinds of biblical examples of God fighting on behalf of his people when he so determines to do so. Just look at the Assyrian army that came against King Hezekiah, and they were all dead men in one night. I think the number was 185,000. Or look at the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Edom when they came against King Jehoshaphat. And we don't know how many they numbered. It had to be a tremendous host. And they all killed one another because God worked in bringing about some confusion amongst them and allowing hostility to grow between them. And then they ended up just all dead corpses lying on the ground. God can fight for his people and defend his people, his city, his name, when he wills to do so. But the time of the end is not a time in which God wanted to defend the churches and congregations. It's not a time that he wanted to protect them from the enemy, Satan, and from the forces of Satan, his emissaries. Because the end of the church was a time in which God came to visit them in judgment, and judgment began at the house of God as the Lord saw all the high places, all of the false, erroneous doctrines and teachings and gospels, and therefore it was like God stepped away and allowed what comes naturally to Satan, what comes naturally to unsaved men under his power. He allowed them to destroy the church. At the same time, God also allowed Satan greater control, greater dominion over the nations of the world, if you've noticed.